There's a symbiotic relationship between text, shape, texture, media technique, and color, and all of these combined evoke emotions in the reader. There are several schools of thought about picture books, but Galda and Chilvitz specifically pulled detail and attention to the fact that for a picture book, the illustrations are required. Without the pictures, the story is incomplete. I combined the late 30s through late 50s together because of the similarities in wartime and depression and dark historical elements. During these years, technology was not as developed and it was extremely expensive to print colored illustrations. Therefore, you see primarily black and white illustrations. Text and illustrations were very unbalanced during this time as well. We see heavily texted stories. Granted, the illustrations are breathtaking, however, they might be classified as illustrated storybooks as the text could exist independently from the illustrations. During this time, we have many immigrant artists. They are primarily of European descent and often settled in the East Coast of America. Mei Lee is iconic because of representation for a non-white character. Although Thomas Hanforth wasn't Chinese himself, he did travel extensively there, and I hope at least that these illustrations are informed by his knowledge and experience gleaned while in the actual country where the story is from. To escape from the devastation and wartime darkness, I feel like the illustrations for this time period are idyllic and humorous and happy and peaceful and gentle, which makes sense when one wants to escape really difficult, traumatic times. In the 60s, we see significantly less immigrant illustrators, a few, but much less than previously. A little bit more color is seeping into illustrations. There are many fairy tales and folktale retellings during this decade. Along with the social and political upheaval, one can't help but think how the historical events might have seeped into the industry. I felt that the illustrations were primarily bold and dramatic during this time period, which, what better word to describe the 1960s than dramatic? We see a very different and shift in the balance between text and illustration. We read the wild rumpus by reading the illustrations. Technique and line and texture I felt was very intriguing during the 1960s. We see Leo Leone utilizing collage and cutout, which was very different. And along with the cross-hatching that was used in Where the Wild Things Are, as well as in the photo on the right, the horizontal lines, there's just this sense of depth and texture and movement that comes from these lines that were very different from previous decades. You can't not mention The Snowy Day by Keats to represent the diversity of the 60s. A beautiful story, one of my favorites as a kid, and really ingenious and creative techniques used to create this story. In the 70s, we have primarily American-born illustrators. Interestingly, though, color-separated versions for printers become available, and you see an explosion of color in the illustrations. Similar to the 1960s, a lot of folktale retellings occur in the 70s, which makes you wonder if there isn't a correlation there between the social and political upheaval that you see seep from the 60s into the 70s. And while I feel like many of the emotions remain the same from the 60s, the drama and the boldness, I do feel like there's a little bit more humor that seeps into the 70s. And very uneven text and illustration balance all over the board. This is the humor I was talking about. You see this cartoon-like quality that is just very, very humorous. You also see with the folktale retellings some folk art. Bold colors, beautiful shapes, beautiful lines and texture utilized. I wanted to mention Ashanti to Zulu not only for the diversity and representation, as Leo Dillon was the first African American to be awarded the Caldecott, but also because while the illustrations are absolutely magnificent, I do think it's really important that we not recommend or provide only a single story. As Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, you can't tell just a single story, or it's important not to tell just a single story or read just a single story or recommend just a single story. Kids need to see books like this, yes, but they also need to see books about modern Africa alongside this book. Often I feel like in the US we have the idea of other continents and countries sort of being stuck in the past, which we need to combat. In the 80s, we see primarily white illustrators, which is interesting. Fairly similar technology. A theme that emerges during the 80s is this surrealism, which is very interesting and evokes these feelings of nostalgia and childlike happiness and dreaminess, which we see in some of the books. This dreaminess, I feel, is perfectly executed in the illustrations. They're soft. There's lots of round, soft shapes, not a lot of texture, not a lot of lines. They're very dreamlike in quality. I wanted to mention Jumanji because it exemplifies the surrealism of the 80s, but I thought it was interesting that Van Allsburg decided to sort of revert back to this monochromatic color scheme, even though the technology of the time allows for full color, and how he is able to portray such simplicity and feeling and texture, but with only using black and white. In the 90s, we have, thankfully, a little bit more diversity going on. Ed Young wins the Caldecott for Limpopo. So we have an Asian American, which is lovely. We also have another Asian American winning for Grandfather's Journey. The balance is crazy. David Weisner and the Rise of the Word. I love David Weisner. I think I'm in love with him. The use of montages and minimal to no words for these illustrations, it's just breathtaking. It's absolutely astonishing. I also wanted to mention Black and White by David Macaulay, primarily for this new concept that we hadn't seen in any of the other previous winners for having 4 stories in one. You have 4 stories and 4 very distinct illustration styles. It's just very creative and very innovative. which, along with an increase in wordless picture books, I feel is indicative of the 90s. It's just a very creative, innovative decade as far as changing things up for the format and concepts. In the 2000s, I have to say I was very disappointed by the lack of diversity. Yes, we do have a sort of mixed family in the Hello Goodbye window, but by far you see much more diversity and representation in other awards, such as the Newbery Award. I think the Caldecott in this category is very disappointing for the 2000s. Oh, more from David Weisner. I absolutely am in love with Flotsam, which you do actually. You do see, although the main character is a young white boy, you do see characters of other races within the little capsule pictures, and the surrealism and just the detail and the beauty in these illustrations is breathtaking. I had to mention Three Little Pigs as it goes along with the lower amount of text and the use of montage, but also for its postmodernism. You see a sort of normal amount of text in the top montage photos, but as the story devolves into this postmodernist scheme where the pigs escape their story, then the text devolves into speech bubbles, which is a brilliant concept. The rest of the 2000s. We have much more diversity when it comes to illustrators. We have some computerized technology coming in for illustrations. We have a little bit more nonfiction coming into play. And illustrators winning: Jerry Pinkney and Javaka Steptoe. Epic illustrations and bringing in some diversity to the winner's circle. 2014 was very interesting because all the winner as well as all of the honorees were wordless, or very few words picture books, which really, according to some of the definitions, is the epitome of a picture book. The pictures tell the story. Locomotive I wanted to mention because I felt like it was one of the first, or at least it was the most obvious, that the illustrator used the font and the text almost as an illustration in and of itself. You see huff, huff, huff is very stylized. Some of the words are different fonts, some of them are different colors. It becomes a part of the illustration. Although I did want to note that this book is about the construction of the railway, and the construction of the railway included many people of color, and there was very little diversity depicted in this book, which I found disappointing. Overall, I think one of the main themes I saw as far as the evolution of picture books was the text and illustration balance. A lot of other components seem to ebb and flow and maybe come back into style or go away, but pretty consistently I felt that throughout the years the text got a little bit less, and the storyline relied more on the illustrations. I also think that while yes, there have been strides that have been made as far as diversity goes, I was disappointed by the low number of non-white individuals that were winners. Perhaps more of the honorees were of diverse backgrounds, but I would say this would be the one area where I think perhaps we should consider making some more progress for the future.